Hey everybody, Ben here from DMC Films, and today we're going to be talking about mixed media, how to make a mixed media piece of artwork, and how some of the techniques that I'm about to show you can be used in all sorts of work, mixed media or not. Now, to call mixed media one particular type of art, like painting or sculpture, and to call this a tutorial, all would probably be just a huge mistake. This is more of a demonstration on how I do some of my work, and hopefully I'll be able to show you some things that will inspire you to do some creative work of your own. Now we're starting out here with two things, a piece of newspaper and a canvas. This is a small stretch canvas of a painting I did sort of as practice, and it hasn't really gained in popularity, and it didn't really pick up in terms of something that would sell. So I'm deciding to paint over it, but rather than just painting over it and starting something new, I'm going to turn this into a mixed media piece. So in order to do this, I'm going to show you how to do this with just basically the cheapest amount of materials you can get your hands on. The items I'll be using aren't really super professional, but it will show you that you don't need anything real fancy to do with the kind of things that I do. We're starting out with some regular white school glue, stuff you can pick up at Walmart for like 99 cents. A jar with a little bit of water in it, and you want to pick up a nice soft bristled paintbrush. Now the reason you want to do with soft bristles rather than real stiff ones is if you're using a stiff bristled brush, there's a chance that when you're attaching the newspaper that it might rip or tear, and you definitely don't want to have that. So you want to have a nice soft bristled brush. I'm going to start out by mixing up some of this glue in with a little bit of water. Now if you do want to get something a little more professional, a little more artistic, you can use a acrylic medium such as soft gel gloss or matte or some kind of an acrylic gel or paste, and they work well for adhering. Alright then. So now we have some glue and water in, we're going to go ahead and mix that up. Now I'm not going to mix this up with the bristles, I'm just going to use the end of the brush for the time being, just because I don't want to, get that in there and have it start drying on me too fast. This is just some dirty paint water. It's had some black paint in it, so it's a little bit gray. But it's not really going to be a problem at all. Okay, now we have a sort of a milky consistency on this glue water. And before we begin, we want to make sure our newspaper is somewhere that we kind of want it to be. Now what you'll see me do a lot of times, especially on a piece like this, which is in progress, is that the newspaper, or whatever paper I'm using, is offset. And that adds a really interesting sort of dynamic to the piece. Now this particular piece, I don't have a big enough sheet of paper, and because this is a stretch canvas, then I want the paper to wrap all the way around. So for the sake of this video, we're just going to kind of keep it nice and straight and work with it down the road for our composition to see what we can do with that. So, as you can see, the paper fits all the way around it nicely, and I can have enough room to wrap it all the way around the edges as well. So, I'm going to start by wetting the entire area of the canvas with some of our funny mixture. And don't be afraid to really use this stuff too. I mean, you should definitely be using a lot of it to cover your surface. Don't be skimpy at all. Take the paper, apply it on top, going from the center outward, pushing it out, trying to get as many wrinkles out as I can. And the thing about working with newspaper is that it's going to wrinkle a little bit. So don't worry about getting out every single crease, because frankly you're not going to be able to do it. If you notice some places aren't sticking down, add a little more of your mixture. Especially the corners too tend to stick up almost immediately. And as you can see, it's starting to wrinkle because we're using a very wet mixture. Okay, now we want to put another layer of this on top of that newspaper. Again, so we're going to work sort of from the outside, trying to push out some of those wrinkles. But again, you might even cause a few more in this instance. doing this, you're also kind of pushing some bubbles out as well to the edges. If we were to have adhered this to the edges ahead of time, then we might have found that the bubbles weren't you wouldn't be able to push them out to the edges quite the same way. Just have like these little air pockets, and that's really what causes the wrinkles, are these air pockets underneath the paper. Still having a lot of trouble with this edge here. Not really sure what that's about. But one thing about painting and art in general is that it's all about, creative problem solving. Okay. As you can see, right now, my landscape that I had underneath here beforehand is actually showing through. Now, granted, when this paper dries, you won't be able to see it anywhere nearly as much, and any layers that we do over top of it will just mask that even further. So for the rest of this piece, we're just going to let it dry completely before we even touch the edges, because if we try and do the edges at this point, the section we've adhered right here might just kind of lift off in some areas, and we just have to start all over again. Alright, now that our surface is now completely dry, we're going to attach our edges as well. So we're going to flip this one over and apply the glue to the bottom as well. Now if you're working on something smaller like a canvas board like this one, you obviously won't have to wrap that around the edge. You can just slice it off. So in that point you would just skip this current step and we'd go on to the next one. But since this is a stretched canvas and we need to wrap the newspaper all the way around, we're going to be doing that now. So we dip in and grab some of our glue wash. That on our edges, just like before, layer underneath and a layer on top. In this case, I'll take this jar, use that as a weight. A piece of tile here, I'll use this as a weight. Make sure that's held down and the section on the side is held in. Slice a little bit around the corner. And careful not to rip things too much, because when the paper is wet, it'll tear very easily. This side. As you can see here, it's starting to tear so much because it's very wet. Make sure the knife you're using is very sharp so you can do this well enough. Just going to re-wet my sides again. Be sure I have plenty of the solution on there. And lift this side. Press it. Pull it in. This side should already be fine, so I can lift that weight off. So you don't need it for a whole lot of time. So this side already, that's sticking, so we're fine there. Lift it up. Apply our glue to the other side. And put some weight on it once again. Again, you just want to make sure all your creases and bubbles that are out, at least to the best of your ability. And just like that, we have our sides taken care of as well. Now again, we have to wait till this dries completely before we do anything else. Okay, now that our piece is finally completely dry all around the edges and on the top, we can finally trim up the edges. Now if you're using a canvas board, something like this, and the newspaper just went out to your edge, all you need to do is flip it over and just slice off right next to the edge. But considering we're using a stretch canvas, that's going to make things a little bit more difficult. Make sure your blade is very sharp. You don't want any ripping or tearing. Just kind of start slow and work your way around. I want to take everything off at once right now. Probably start making a cut underneath it, but not quite on the edge, because you still want to have it wrap around just a little bit. So it looks something like that. This way you have the wood, the canvas, and the paper right on top of each other. And obviously doesn't, affect it from the front at all. Just want to trim it up. Make sure you don't cut off anything that you think you're going to need later on. There's sort of a little bit of a hole here on this edge. I'm going to clean that up later. This, obviously don't need that because it's loose. There we have a completed edge. You do the same thing all the way around. Kind of trim up your edges. Again, little issue on the corner there, but not the end of the world. It's a mixed media piece. You can actually mess up quite a few times, and really your viewer won't even really know, because it's such an interesting and sporadic piece to have just these little frayed corners. You probably won't irritate anyone with that. And there we have our piece trimmed up and ready to go. Now that we have our edges all trimmed up and ready to go, you want to decide in sort of which direction you want the text to be, and whether it's vertical or horizontal, or if it's at an angle. Choose the orientation of your canvas. Now, in this point, I kind of like the way it is. I'm gonna just leave it at that. I've grabbed a nice soft bristle brush, and we're gonna add a layer of watercolors as our first layer. I grabbed a little bit of water, and these are just basic watercolors that you give to little kids. The only difference is I've used them quite a bit, as you can probably tell. And I'm going to make this one a little bit orange, sort of an orangish red. Just because it's a little more of an interesting color. It's bright, it shows up, that kind of thing. Because our paper was just put on with glue and I don't have the any kind of acrylic medium on it, the paint's going to soak into the paper and really stain the surface. If you wanted to keep it as more of just a coat and not anything else, consider some type of an isolation coat in between your layers. At this point, I'm actually going to add a little bit of variation to this. One thing you can do with watercolor is put salt on it to add little sort of bubbly textures, or you can just splatter some water right back down onto it. That's all I'm going to do here. Okay. Now, as before, we must let our layers dry before we do anything else to them, so we're going to let this layer dry, and then we'll come back to it once it's dry to do the next step. Alright, our watercolor layer is not quite dry. It's a little bit moist still, but it's dry enough for what we're going to be doing next. Now, a lot of times in the work that I do that's mixed media, I like to add splatters to it, and that's what we're going to do next. So I have a little tub of acrylic paint here. So I'm going to grab, this is just some white. I'm just going to grab a little bit of that, water it down, and splatter it on. This technique, if you've seen my tutorial on making stars, this is the exact same thing. It's just, you don't have to be real precise with it. You can be as sporadic and ridiculous as you want, because you want expressive and very different kind of looking splatters. So just kind of do any old wherever. On here doesn't really matter. And however much or how little you want it to be is really up to you. I'm trying to get sort of a concentrated section in the center here. And there we have splatters. Now this is going to take a significantly long time to dry, especially because a lot of these bigger blobs of paint, so that's going to take a significantly longer time to dry. So I figured give this a couple hours and we'll be back to finish this one up. Alright, now that our splattery layer is dry, we're going to add one more thing before we add our final visual elements to this piece. Now, as much as I said in the beginning that I was not going to add anything real fancy, I'm going to have to break that little promise just for this. This is acrylic ink. Now, the difference between acrylic ink and other types of ink is acrylic ink are pigment-based rather than dye-based, which means that they won't fade over time. And I'm just going to add a couple of drops to this up on top. I'm starting real low and just going real high to give it a good splatter. More there, and that about does that. It's kind of does that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to let that section dry, which won't take anywhere near as long as it did for the big blobs of acrylic paint. These will take maybe a half hour to dry, and then we're going to go in and add some black on top of this and finish up the piece up. Now, as you can see, I also added a couple of drops of yellow to the red as well, and now that that layer, again, is completely dry, we can just keep on mixing in really whatever we really pretty much want to. At this point, I tend to take a look around my studio and say, okay, what do I have that might look pretty cool in this piece? And so I'm actually going to grab a few different things. I have a red pastel pencil and charcoal pencil. Kind of just add some little accents to different parts of this. Oil pastel. And with some black acrylic paint. Since my usual thing is trees, I'm going to make a tree element in this piece. And by watering down the acrylic, I'm creating sort of an ink-like environment and mimicking some general techniques that you may not normally expect to see with acrylics. So if I leave this darker and just work from the top, make it a little lighter from the way down, I'm creating different land masses and separating them, and using the sort of natural contrast there to do so. Especially right down here, this is really soaking into the paper. Again, if you're painting the edges, you don't want to forget about them. Make sure you are working your way down slowly. And there we have it. Now, as our layer of acrylic paint is drying, it's dry sort of now in some areas and not in others. I'm going to take some chalk pastels and just kind of mix them in a little bit. Now, because we used red and yellow, and we sort of have this burnt, sort of goldenish orange color, we don't want to use a color like blue to really offset it and make it like strictly primary colors. If we take a look at the color wheel, the red and orange and yellow side, you can tell is, you know, kind of has their nice warm tones, but you want to have a tone that's not completely opposite. So you want to pick either sort of a green or maybe like a red-violet to really kind of give a nice balance to the rest of your colors. I have a little bit of this purple that I'm going to mix right on top of that funny red. It's a sort of bluish purple, so I don't want to use too much of it. Like I said, I don't want to go for a blue look, I want to go for a sort of a purple look. And doing very light layers with the blue and the red will give just what you need for that. Much like using glazing layers in acrylics, you can really create some interesting effects. I'm going to take a little bit of yellow-green here, kind of use it down in the lower sections, maybe give an illusion of some grass. And because this is still a little moist, it's going to sit on top more so, and I can't blend as much with it, but it's actually probably better in this instance. And wherever you add your color, you want to make sure it's balanced. You have color on some side and color on the other side. You don't want to create a completely offset environment. Now, it might be difficult for you guys to see, but just that little bit of color has really pulled the rest of this piece together. So I'm almost done with this piece. The next few steps I'm not actually going to show you on camera, I'm just going to tell you about because they're kind of tedious and they don't really show up well and translate well through video. First thing I'm going to do to this thing is spray on a layer of workable fixative. Now this is where it gets a little bit fancy, and I do apologize for that. Workable fixative you can pick up pretty much at any art store though. This allows you to fix anything that might come loose, like water to the watercolor or any of the pastel that might smear. This will fix it down and make sure there won't be any smears or smudges or anything like that for any next layer you might put on. Now you're more than welcome to use this between layers, however it creates a slightly toothy texture and you may not want that for painting on the surface down the road. After that I'm going to go in with my trusty white color pencil, add some highlights to the trees and things just to really make them pop and stand out. And finally I'm going to go in with the fancy layer of soft gel gloss, and that I've used in various pieces and applied with my thumb to give it a really interesting texture when it's done. It dries to a nice high gloss. All my pieces usually get either a coat of this or a spray coat of just a regular spray gloss finish, and that'll really make the colors pop and last for a long period of time. When you're using the soft gel gloss, you can put it on as thick or as thin as you want, and at that point you can just kind of smear it on, create little bubbly textures and the ridges, and do all kind of really interesting things. So those are my last few steps for this one. If you don't have all these more complex or fancy materials, you could easily call this piece done. Now for more tips, tutorials, time-lapse videos, please stay tuned to the DMC Films channel here on YouTube. This is Ben. See you guys next time.